All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for setting this up. Thank you for everyone for joining. Let me know if I'm not coming out so clearly. My mic isn't always great. Um, yeah. So I guess very quickly about me and then about sort of the situation at hand. I'm Jewish American. I have Israeli citizenship, and I grew up on Long Island in an Orthodox Jewish family, and very, very right wing, very Zionist, and kind of, you know, basically sort of accepted the narrative I was raised on. Um, the occupation of the West Bank was never mentioned, or the occupation of any of the Palestinian territories. It was always like totally glossed over. The only time we ever said the word occupation was to argue that it doesn't exist. So, just from like an intellectual standpoint, really, really extreme and counterfactual. And then after high school, kind of the norm in my community was that, all of the kids would do a gap year learning tour in Israel. And I did that like all of my peers. I very specifically ended up on a program called Michinat Yayud that was actually in an illegal settlement in the West Bank, which, kind of, as I mentioned, I had no idea what that really meant. I knew that there was this weird checkpoint we went past. I knew that there were different license plates, and I knew that there were more Arabs where I lived compared to, where my twin brother was learning in a town sort of inside internationally recognized Israel called Ramat Beit Shemesh. We never said Palestinians. Everyone was just Arab. That identity was completely erased. And long story short, I saw things on that year that definitely didn't sit right with me and made me uncomfortable that I didn't unpack too much and kind of just shoved out of my brain. Note, I mentioned the checkpoint in between Israel and the West Bank, and also the fact that Palestinians inside the West Bank had different license plates. Growing up American and having the context of Jim Crow and segregation, that really, really jumped out at me. And then I got to college, and kind of long story short, 2015, 2016, Trump round one really radicalized me politically and kind of made me care about politics for the first time. Just hearing everything that was coming out of his mouth and how like obviously repulsive it all was, especially seeing the community that I grew up in really rally behind it, was a huge wake up call. And with that, I kind of started to question the narrative I was raised on about Israel and Palestine much more. And I really, really, the moment that sticks out that, feels very kind of important to remember, to mention, and just shows how powerful human experiences and interactions can be, is that when I was in college, the Hillel Club, like the Jewish club on campus, um, hosted a Palestinian to come and speak, which for Hillel itself is no small thing, if anyone's familiar. And he was a college student. He went to, I think, Ithaca College in upstate New York. My age, a year or two younger or older, I don't remember. I don't even remember his name or anything about him, really. All I remember is that he was from the city of Bethlehem, which is right next to Efrat, the settlement that I lived in. So that really resonated with me. And I remember already at this point beginning to learn a little more about sort of the actual reality on the ground. And I remember thinking very naively, oh, we were neighbors. Neighbors under entirely different legal systems, separated by an apartheid wall. But that's how I thought of it at the time. And he kind of told his whole story and mentioned totally in passing needing to get a permit to cross the checkpoint, to go to Jerusalem, to apply for a visa, to go to Jordan, to fly to the US. And I remember thinking, like, wait, what? Like, I hopped on a plane and landed and walked around like I owned the place. And this guy was born and raised in Bethlehem and had this crazy, crazy experience with these checkpoints that were, for me, a formality, were incredibly real for him. And I remember thinking, oh, that's apartheid. And this is in 2017 when that word was kind of more controversial than it is now and less of a settled issue than it is now. Not that it's unfortunately a perfectly settled issue. There are people, still insisting that it's not accurate, but that's besides the point. That really was the beginning of the end. And kind of after that, there was no going back to the old way that I viewed the reality on the ground, but kind of through a product of my upbringing and through my time in the region. I have a lot of cousins in Israel and in settlements, actually. And we would go and visit all the time for Jewish holidays and vacation. And I mentioned this gap year that, deeply problematic aspects of it aside, I mostly remember fondly as like I was an 18-year-old on my own for the first time. So I really, after this kind of big political shift, still wanted to spend more time in the area and kind of knew that that meant being involved, being engaged in real activism and not sort of just hanging out on the beach in Tel Aviv and being like, no, but I'm against it. And I didn't know what that would mean at the time because I wasn't so politically active in college. Like I mentioned before Trump, I never really thought or cared about politics. So I went to grad school at Tel Aviv University to become an English teacher. Spoiler alert, I didn't go through with that, but I kind of landed and just reached out to every single activist group I could find, every organization. I would just like Google and email and Facebook message and whatever. And long story short, I found a group called All That's Left, which is a group of international Jews living in Israel and Palestine and engaging in solidarity work. And it's very big tent, very non-hierarchical and grassroots. And by that nature, people doing all sorts of different things, just depending on what there's energy for. And I would say I pretty quickly became very interested in what's called protective presence, which is basically predominantly non-Palestinian activists, and kind of the more privilege you have, the better. So, if you're a white-skinned Ashkenazi Jew with Israeli citizenship, you're really at the highest premium, as, cynical as that sounds, to be with Palestinian communities that are under particular risk of settler violence. So particular risk is already becoming an oxymoron in this context when everyone's under such intense risk. But to be physically present with these Palestinian communities in the hopes that just our presence sort of de-escalates and causes less violence, whether that's from settlers or from soldiers, and sort of lowers the rate of the constant impediments of daily life. So it's much more, it's become a 24/7 endeavor, but it's really particularly asked for and needed around sort of agricultural seasons or certain specific, this guy needs to harvest his crops, or the olive harvest is a very important time of year for Palestinians in general and for their life and their economy, and by extension of that for this form of activism. And sometimes it will be sort of more random, mundane stuff of, this guy needs a ride to the checkpoint and needs to go through the checkpoint and really wants somebody who, like, he somehow got a permit and he wants somebody who's actually able to cross with him to join him, and things like that. I started doing it. I moved to Tel Aviv in 2019, late 2019, and started getting involved pretty much right away. Then kind of COVID happened. And that was when late 2020, sort of early peak COVID, was when I first started kind of doing a lot of protective presence. Mostly because it was a much bigger ask all of a sudden. I'd moved to Jerusalem at this point already to sort of be closer to the West Bank physically, and also to kind of be more to live with my friends in the activist community that I'd made that was way more Jerusalem based than Tel Aviv based. And with the beginning of COVID, there was a much bigger ask for protective presence and a much bigger ask for kind of a constant form of protective presence, of people staying the night, sleeping with different communities to be there in the morning if they were worried about a demolition or worried about an attack or whatever it was. Um, and at this point, I was pretty much, 2 or 3 times a week driving from Jerusalem to spend the night usually in a region called Masafriyata in the South Hebron Hills at all the way bottom of the West Bank. It's about an hour, 5 minutes, hour, 10 minutes tops drive from Jerusalem, stay the night, wake up, hopefully nothing happens, drive back. And there were weeks where I started to joke that it was basically commuting. And that spring, I actually joined a program called Hinenu with the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, where I lived in Masafriyata for 3 straight months and did this just full-time protective presence. And yeah, just to kind of like touch on what a day in the life is, especially when you're there for 3 months and not just kind of going back and forth. I remember the first week of this 3 months, literally, there was like, it kind of worked out as a crash course / tutorial that I remember, Monday, settler kids stole a Palestinian's phone. And then Tuesday, there was an army raid on the village, and I think somebody might have been arrested. And then Wednesday, there were demolitions all day. And you just wake up and you are driving after bulldozers and soldiers and documenting for the entire day. It was like across different villages, going into villages that don't have roads or that barely have roads, like switching cars because only certain cars can even access these villages. And then on Thursday, the end of the week, we were in the village of Susia, and there's a settlement of the same name nearby, and settlers from the settlement of Susia came sort of masked up with like full King David style slingshots and started like slinging rocks at us. And there was a soldier right there in this pillbox nearby, and she just like yelled at them once or twice, but made, zero attempt to stop them. She's not trained to stop them. And then, thankfully nobody was hurt, and we had to go to the police report. We had to go to the police station, which is in a settlement, in a pretty extreme settlement called Kiryat Arba, right next to the city of Hebron. And we had to like wait outside and report this incident that we know nothing is going to come of it. And, I remember just like sitting there for an hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it is, like doing nothing and just being like, I preferred the rocks to sort of this like Kafkaesque bureaucratic torture. And that really, like, I called it the crash course, and that's because that is sort of the stuff that happens every single day. The fact that it really happened one after another like that is a little noteworthy, even 4 or 5 years later, now that I've been doing this work for all that time. But not a single incident in that week sticks out as particularly extreme at all. I would say the opposite. Things have only escalated so much that if any of those incidents were to kind of happen now, it would almost automatically be so much more severe, and just that the situation has escalated so intensely. The end of this 3-month stay was May 2021, which kind of, for anyone here who's been following Palestine for a little longer, might remember as a very big escalation where Israel heavily brutalized and suppressed prayers at Al-Aqsa during Ramadan and was at war with Hamas. And there was a lot of sort of sectarian violence, I guess I would call it, inside Israel, particularly in mixed cities that have mixed cities is a misnomer. All of the cities that Israel likes to think of as mixed are very, very segregated within the cities. It's just that the cities have noteworthy populations of both Israelis and Palestinians, which of course in a non-apartheid state would just be called a city, but I digress. there was a lot of sort of civilian violence all over the region, and in sort of this context, and also at the time, it was the craziest escalation that any of us had ever experienced, and now we remember it fondly. Um, During this time, I was attacked by pretty severely by 3 or 4 settlers, me and another activist who is now 76 years old. We were both attacked by like 3 or 4 mass settlers with clubs and sticks. He was hit in the head pretty badly. I was thankfully not. I was hurt. I got hit in the knee. I got hit in the arm, but no major injuries. He's thankfully okay too, but at the time was much scarier. And when I went, I joked he got the lucky deal. He got to go to the hospital because I had to go to the police station to report this. And when I did, I actually was arrested. The cop told me that you're involved, but you're also a suspect. And he said, basically, it turned out that the settlers had reported that I attacked them, and I was arrested and interrogated, and it was a complete sham interrogation. That was basically just being gaslit for 2 hours and being asked ridiculous poor faith questions, including quote unquote, "Are you a terrorist?" And after that, I was banned from the West Bank for 2 weeks, which is kind of a very typical sort of stock punishment when activists are arrested, especially activists with Israeli passports that can't be deported. They'll just sort of give you a term of release that you're banned for 2 weeks and you don't have to go to court and whatever. And that had already, getting arrested for being attacked is something that has happened to Palestinians forever. At the time, the fact that it happened to a Jewish person with Israeli citizenship was definitely noteworthy, and a lot of my friends were like totally shocked about it. Activists that have been doing this work for a long time were really incredibly surprised. And now that is like totally the norm. That's, like I said, it's all constant escalations, and it's all a giant ratchet effect that basically anything that happens causes an escalation, and there is no mechanism in place for things to de-escalate. So the most obvious example is October 7th happens and Hamas, carries out their attack on southern Israel, and Israel starts their war/genocide, and kind of very connectedly, there's a massive escalation in the West Bank immediately after. Settlers are going crazy, and there actually becomes a brand new phenomenon of settlers that are kind of also doing reserve army duty, literally just throwing on military uniform and carrying out like horrific attacks and acts of terrorism in this context. And soldiers have been involved in settler violence before to varying degrees. It's incredibly common for soldiers to just be standing there watching, not doing anything. It's less common, but still common for them to actively join in. But after October 7th, there was this new phenomenon that we started calling settler soldiers, where we literally just don't know if a soldier is even, if somebody in uniform is a soldier or not. And things eventually de-escalated a little compared to that immediate post-October 7th escalation, but the new baseline was so much more volatile and so much more violent than October 6th. And another incident, another case where we saw this ratchet effect was the second temporary ceasefire and hostage exchange in last January, where there was First of all, there's a catch-22 in the first place, in the fact that both the war/genocide and the ceasefire both cause massive escalation and a massive increase in violence that Palestinians in the West Bank face. And after this hostage deal, basically during the ceasefire, where Israel did not cease to fire, but did sort of decrease their aggression on Gaza, they literally had more manpower. So they had more soldiers to put in the West Bank. So there was a huge uptick in the soldier presence in the West Bank. And also what they did during this time was, one, they put up gates all over the West Bank. So the West Bank is already, to kind of, paint a picture, according to the Oslo Accords, it's cut up into areas A, B, and C. Area A is the major Palestinian cities, and it's basically ostensibly under the full control of the Palestinian Authority, but Israel raids it all the time. Soldiers enter, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jenin, Nablus, whatever it is, fairly often, as they please. Area B is basically the suburbs, and it's sort of mixed. Israeli soldiers have the final say over quote unquote security matters, but the Palestinian Authority is in charge of infrastructure and sort of civil matters. And then there's Area C, which is where I've been most active, and it's where all of these rural Palestinian villages are, and it's effectively annexed. It's under full Israeli civil and military control, which basically means that if a Palestinian in Area C has any sort of legal complaint, he has to go to the Israeli police. He has to, call the army or the police or whatever it is. And obviously, they don't care about him. There's a 99% chance that they'll be ignored. There actually is a statistic that I think 98% of Palestinian complaints against settlers to the Israeli police are totally ignored and don't lead to any conviction, or certainly not, barely even investigation, certainly not any conviction or any charge. And Area A is already kind of a series of ghettos or Bantustans, to use, the South African word. And there are checkpoints in and out of the major cities that is a huge form of control for Israel, because it's definitionally sort of these key roads that only Palestinians use, that settlers have no reason to use. It's actually illegal according to Israeli law for them to go into Palestinian cities. So you can control these roads and just only impact Palestinian cities and not your civilians that are illegally living in the region. And during the last ceasefire, in last January, Israel put up, I think, literally hundreds of more gates all throughout the region, usually, again, on these key roads, sort of leading in and out of Palestinian cities, but not only, also out of smaller towns and villages. One was put up outside the village of Al-Khair in Musafir Yatta, where I lived for 3 months, on the 3 months that I mentioned before, and also 6 months later in a different context. And these gates are almost worse than checkpoints, than manned checkpoints, because a manned checkpoint with a soldier at it, you might get through. It might take you hours. You might be questioned and harassed and degraded, but you might get through and go where you're trying to go. Whereas with these gates, if they're closed, which certain ones are closed very often, certain ones I haven't seen closed ever, that's it. Go home, try again tomorrow. They're not manned. They just close them and they leave. You can walk around, but if you need to get anywhere with a car, then that's not practical. And these gates are put off, and then the ceasefire ends, and Israel returns half of these troops back to the front lines in Gaza, but the gates are still there, and the settlers are still pissed that there was a ceasefire deal and start taking out all of that aggression on Palestinians. So, that's, again, that constant ratchet effect of things escalating and having no way to turn back. The dial only goes in one direction. I see a question in the chat, and no, the gates are not weaponized. They're really very, very, it's just a swinging gate on a block of concrete. They're very low tech. There's a lot more surveillance technology used inside the city of Hebron, but that's a little outside my kind of experience and expertise. I haven't spent so much time in the city. Um, and yeah, basically, I think so. For the last 6 months of my time in Palestine, I was working with an organization called Rabbis for Human Rights. I was their field coordinator in the Safriyata, and kind of in tandem with that, and along with some other things all coming together, I decided to live full time in the village of Khair. I am very, very close with the community there, and really am lucky to have a special relationship with them. And I asked, I just talked to some of the community leaders about it, and we got a little house for me. I paid rent to the council. I paid rent to the city council every month, and kind of through my job, and also just through the relationships I had at this point, was engaging in full-time protective presence while living in Khair. And that was a really, really special experience for a million reasons. My Arabic improved. I really deepened my connection with the community, and it really, really helped me see the Palestinian experience in a much deeper way. There's things that I'm never going to be Palestinian. I'm always going to be Jewish. I'm always going to have Israeli citizenship. I'm always going to have that separation and that level of privilege. But those 6 months really, really much more intimately gave me a better idea of what the constant Palestinian experience is like, and just how much it is every single day. Something happened every single day. Someone got attacked or held up at a checkpoint or arrested and just thrown at the side of the road and just left there, or whatever it is. And it might not have happened to you or to somebody, but it happened nearby, and you're a degree or two removed at all times. And something that I had two experiences that really reminded me over these 6 months just how much protective presence works. And I think, for all these years that I was doing protective presence, I believed in the work, I believed in the solidarity, I believed in the connections I was making with these people. That's so important in its own right. And I think a lot of times under it all, I had a certain skepticism of like, I know that apparently things are worse when I'm not around. Like, I don't know, people keep telling me that this form of activism, the Palestinian activists keep telling me that it's helpful. So I kept showing up. And then when I was living in Khair for 6 months, I really, really saw how much the math of the phone calls didn't add up. I'm living in this village 24/7, and all of the phone calls that I'm getting that, oh, this settler is grazing his sheep in the middle of the village, the soldiers are here, settlers are blocking the road, whatever it is, were overwhelmingly happening when I wasn't around. So the math was kind of not adding up, and it really showed how much like just presence was de-escalating. And when it isn't enough to de-escalate, as I've kind of, through all of my firsthand stories, I hope has become clear that it's not always enough, unfortunately. Then there's all the extra stuff. Then there's documenting and using, unfortunately, my privilege to help things get a bigger platform in media. There's using my privilege to stand between Palestinians and settlers or soldiers, because I know that I'm not going to be attacked, or certainly not attacked as badly. Helping with soldiers and police, and calling soldiers and calling police, and helping with police reports if that's asked of us. That's kind of the stuff that becomes also part of the activism, part of solidarity, especially depending on sort of your positionality and depending on your language skills and that sort of thing. I speak Hebrew and Arabic, so I was calling the police all the time. I had like a very funny moment where my text log with the police was just like pages long, because they send you a little feedback survey every single time you call them, which is incredibly bizarre. And a very incredibly concrete moment where I learned just how different it is for Palestinians was in March, almost exactly a year ago, actually. I basically was getting back to my car after a day with this community near Hebron, that the community had fled their lands from settler violence and had a signed court statement, a like signed decree from the court that they're allowed to go back to their land and that soldiers have to protect them and facilitate that. And through work, they got in touch with my boss who asked me to go and join them for this first day back. We get there, and right away, soldiers come, settlers see us, calls the army comes and kicks me out and says, I show him the court, the documents and everything. He doesn't care. He says, oh, well, they can stay, you can't. Which is kind of, all of the different games they have of getting around this, that he knows that once I leave, the Palestinians are going to leave because they're not going to feel safe. So then, long story short, I left the village and got back to my car, which was its own saga for another day. And basically, as I was getting to my car, which I maybe not so smartly parked very close to a military base, two soldiers came up to me and started asking questions about who I was, where I was going, whatever. And they were getting slowly more aggressive. I was really trying to just give polite one-word answers and de-escalate. And eventually, one started filming, and then I started filming, and then he yelled at me, "Oh, you just ruined 6 hours of your life," and started attacking me, like really, really constantly, violently, like pushing me, punching me, throwing me up against a car and throwing me onto the ground, and then hit me in the face with either his gun or his boot. I don't really know. I know that it wasn't flesh, and I know that I had a black eye after. And he was yelling at me in Arabic. He was yelling at me, "Dear Balak," which means like "watch yourself" or "be careful" in Arabic. And threatened, demanded that I unlock my phone, and actually tried using the face lock, which I don't have for this reason, and repeatedly told me that if I didn't open my phone, he would kill me. I unfortunately eventually did, and basically it became, a lot was going on, and I don't think I was thinking exactly as quickly as I maybe usually do. But it became very clear that they thought I was Palestinian, and they zip tied me and blindfolded me, and one actually wanted to put my head inside a shopping bag, and like another one of the soldiers were like kind of convinced him not to. And they dragged me into the military base and just kind of forced me to kneel on the ground there. And again, this is when it's like when I'm like calming down a little and grasping what's happening. And it's very, very clear that they think I'm Palestinian. And then finally they look at my ID and they start kind of talking amongst themselves, and they're just like really confused and asking me questions. And one of them goes, in Hebrew, says, "Oh, apparently he's Jewish. His name is Shmuel," which is the Hebrew version of Sam, and that's what it says on my ID. And he speaks Hebrew. And this revelation that I was Jewish was very, very confusing for them, and night and day for me. I wasn't touched after that. Like, they still hated me because I'm a leftist and a traitor, quote unquote, or whatever. And they started arguing basically about how much it matters or doesn't matter that I'm not Palestinian and that I'm Jewish, and basically debating how much they should sort of rough me up and kick the crap out of me after this fact. But it was incredibly clear that, all of a sudden, my life wasn't like totally discardable. And like one like kicked me in the back of the foot or something after that, one of the more kind of aggressive ones who was really gung-ho about it. And then I sat there for like an hour, again, basically wasn't touched. And eventually handed over to the police and arrested and interrogated and banned from the West Bank for 2 weeks again, just like in that earlier story. But it's very important to remember, to mention that even, there's the sort of there's like the de facto non-legal difference in how I was treated as a person when they knew that I wasn't Palestinian and when they knew that I was Jewish, and how much that I became a human being to them who they can't just like kill with zero mercy. Um, and obviously, the experience didn't exactly become fun after that, but it was really humongous difference. And then even more so, there's the de jure legal difference. The second that I wasn't Palestinian, I had legal rights, and that's not a fuzzy thing. That's what's in the books. That is the tech. That is the language of the legal system. That Palestinians, as a civilian, as a citizenry living under military occupation, are subject to military law. If they are arrested, they are arrested by the Israeli military. If they are brought to court, it's an Israeli military court that has a 99% conviction rate, I think. And when I was arrested after when these soldiers handed me over to the police to be arrested, I was arrested by the civil police. I was arrested, I was given access to a lawyer and basic rights that weren't even always exactly observed or followed, but I technically had them. And then I get this release form and I'm banned from the West Bank for 2 weeks or whatever. If I were Palestinian, first of all, I'd be dead. Or it's like exceedingly likely that I'd be dead, and that you would have read some news story the next day about how Israeli soldiers neutralized a Palestinian terrorist who posed a threat outside this military base near the town of Seir. But even if I weren't killed, which is possible, then I would have been subject to this military court system, and I was accused officially. During my interrogation, the charge against me was that I assaulted a soldier. And if I were subject to a total sham court with that accusation, I would be in jail for weeks, months, if not years, in military detention or in the military jail. There's this legal concept of military detention where basically the Israeli army, if you're Palestinian, only if you're Palestinian, is able to arrest you with no charge and just detain you indefinitely. They need to get it like renewed periodically, and they need to get like approval that it's a security matter or whatever the exact language is. But basically, the vast majority of Palestinians in Israeli custody do not have a charge against them, and certainly not a conviction against them. And the way a friend of mine who has sort of much more impressive encyclopedic knowledge of the legal ins and outs than I do put it is, there are no laws in the West Bank. And that sounds like, oh, it's chaotic, it's the Wild West, it's Lord of the Flies. And that's not what it means. What it means is much worse, which is just there are no laws by virtue of military occupation. There's no legislative body that passes and votes on laws. There's a commander who says something, and that becomes law. And yeah, that experience just really, and I'd heard stories of this sort of thing happening to Palestinians, I would say often. I would say lots of stories of this sort of experience happening to Palestinians. And I, of course, believed it, but there is no way to internalize it if it doesn't happen to you, or, if you never even witnessed it. So to have that experience was incredibly eye-opening. And, for 5-10 minutes, whatever it was, I was as close to Palestinian as possible. And I also have the glaring knowledge of the fact that they found out that I'm Jewish and how quickly that changed the situation. And, if you are actually Palestinian, they don't have that sort of get out of jail free card that happens once soldiers check your ID. Yeah, that basically is, the situation in a nutshell, and kind of will very quickly say that since I left, there have been more and more constant escalations. This past olive harvest was the most violent one on record. There were several settler arson attacks against Palestinian communities, against Palestinian buildings and olive farms and crops. And now, of course, with the war with Iran and now the ground invasion of Lebanon, it all leads to escalations in the West Bank, and that's because that's what the system is designed to do. There's the extremist factions of the Israeli right-wing government that say it out loud, and they're the more established ones that don't say it out loud. But the goal since 67, maybe before that, but since 67, when Israel first occupied the West Bank, has pretty explicitly been to expel all the Palestinians, and basically anything that happens is an excuse to do that. So yeah, that's kind of everything on my end, and I would love to just sort of open it up to questions.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Cool. Yeah, thanks for joining us, Sam. I have a couple of easy questions. I'm just going to rattle off like 3 questions. The first one is, when you took the gap year, is that the same thing as doing Aliyah? And my second question is, do you have any idea how many people are doing protective presence? And is it growing? Is that presence growing? And is there coverage across the West Bank? Like, how many villages in the West Bank have protective presence? Yeah, those are my questions for now.
So the gap year is different than Aliyah, in that you don't get Israeli citizenship. You just sort of, some people might, before or later or whatever, but you just get a student visa and go. It's basically studying abroad. And what was the second question?
How many?
Right.
Do you have any idea how many people are?
It's hard to give an accurate number because it kind of shuffles in and out. Really, most of the activist groups set up in the West Bank are very, very grassroots, and a lot of that is because it's harder to track and kind of harder to really legally punish in any concrete way. You can't deem a WhatsApp group a terrorist group. It probably about 100, and that's really, like I said, it's hard to count, and that's definitely spread out over communities and over locations and over activist groups, and how many people might show up once a month or once every few months versus really very, very consistently weekly and daily. And in terms of coverage, it's definitely growing in general, in terms of people and in terms of villages, which is depressing that it's necessary, but also beautiful, inspiring that people are answering the call. There really just is a massive energy about it. Like, people want to get involved in this work, people that are already living in the region and internationals. The whole ecosystem is kind of mixed of international Jews and of left-wing and anti-Zionist Israelis and of internationals and North Americans and Europeans. And I would say that I can't give a number on how many villages. I would say that there definitely is, kind of broadly speaking, pretty big regional coverage of most of the major regions of the West Bank have pretty thorough protective presence systems in place. I hope that the answer will be more coherent, but honestly, it might not be. Yeah, it's definitely kind of literally in terms of like literally flying. There's no problem. Like I have an Israeli passport, I get right through the airport, no question. And sort of just like broader kind of life in Israeli society when you're, um, have the beliefs that I have and are doing the work that I continue to do. It's incredibly alienating with like weird contradictions to that. Like Israel is very much a right-wing country, and the society and the populace is very much right-wing and like broadly speaking supportive of the military apparatus and of the actions of the military. One kind of crack in the armor of that is that settlers are kind of a pariah in Israeli society of like the extremist right-wing settlers in the West Bank, and the religious Zionist movement are not kind of like the elite echelon of society. I think this is how settled colonies always function, that like you get the kind of least desirable people and less privileged people to be on the front lines and do the dirty work. And what that means is in practice is basically that there is like very ready condemnation of settlers, even if there is zero condemnation of settlement and of the occupation and of Israel's control of the region. So kind of in terms of interacting with the public, just, and obviously that condemnation doesn't lead to any sort of action, but that's a different issue. If you kind of, if I'm like hanging out in Tel Aviv and talking to some random guy at a cafe, I've learned how to talk about the work that I do that makes it as unobjectionable as possible. Depending on like how much energy I have and how much I like don't want to get into it with some rando. And one of the ways to do that is kind of focus on the settlers, and the most extremist settlers, and kind of that you're positioning yourself against them instead of positioning yourself against the army and the occupation and the state. And then it's pretty unobjectionable to any more like moderate to liberal Israeli. Obviously, there are people that are just like totally gung ho about it, and or like the settlers are doing God's work and whatever. But I wouldn't say that they're even the majority. But like I said, it is very, very alienating. You do basically end up in a situation where like you can only really feel at ease and comfortable hanging out with sort of the other activists or like the other broader left-wing community, even if there are people that are not like going in the West Bank so much, but are like in that world, and that's, and everyone knows that that's what their stances are. You end up only dating within that community, which gets complicated. And yeah, I will say that I've like rarely, as alienating as it is, I very rarely feel like unsafe out and about. Like I'm not like, oh, if people find out what I think, I'm gonna get like lynched on the spot. So much as it will just like be deeply uncomfortable for me, and I don't want to deal with that. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of Jerusalem, Jerusalem is basically divided into East and West Jerusalem. West Jerusalem is sort of recognized as part of like an internationally accepted Israel, and East Jerusalem illegally annexed by Israel, but considered under occupation by any legal expert, and kind of Palestinians in East Jerusalem don't have Israeli citizenship, as opposed to a Palestinian who was born and raised in Haifa or Jaffa or Tel Aviv does. They have Jerusalem residency, which can be revoked, which is a very important distinction. And usual reasons for being revoked are the biggest one is if you leave. So but not just the country. Like if you leave Jerusalem, like if you're a Palestinian in East Jerusalem who goes to college in Ramallah and starts living in Ramallah, then they'll say, that your center of life is not in Jerusalem, and you don't live there anymore. You're not a resident anymore. You're just stuck in the West Bank now. And because of that legal reality, first of all, there's an effort to do that. There's a desire to do that. They want to kick out all the Palestinians as much as possible. And Jerusalem, the entire city, east and west, is just a really, really intense, radicalized place. Like the Israeli population there is definitely more right wing compared to, say Tel Aviv or most parts of like the broader Tel Aviv area. And the Palestinian community is in this weird limbo. They're just kind of like really, really in their own legal category and in their own stratosphere of society, that like some of them might work inside Israel and basically, speak perfect Hebrew and have that like in and out of Israeli society, whereas some might live or work or go to school in the West Bank and be way more kind of only in Palestinian communities. And not have any meaningful interaction with Israelis, other than the fact that the Israeli border police, it's called Magav in Hebrew, are rampantly present in East Jerusalem. So yeah, East Jerusalem is like a very, very crucial sort of front of what's happening in Palestine and of the settler project and of the ethnic cleansing effort. And it has a very, very distinct, different way that it looks, in a way that tends to be a lot more legalistic and sort of nicer than what happens in the West Bank. It's certainly less, renegade terrorists just attacking Palestinians. I may say renegades are supported by the state, but civilians ostensibly, and a lot more border police wearing uniforms beating up Palestinians, and instead, demolishing home evictions, demolishing homes under sort of more legalistic jargon of like, oh, we've reviewed the paperwork and it turns out that XYZ, you don't own this home that you've lived in for hundreds of years. That's kind of the situation in East Jerusalem. There's a group called a nonprofit organization called Iramim that focuses on East Jerusalem that, we'll probably have really good resources to learn more. It means City of Nations in Hebrew. And yeah, the second question of Zionist organizations kind of luring in immigrants. Basically, yes. It's when you sort of make Aliyah, which is the term that Israel uses for Jewish immigration, it means to ascend, which is like its own whole thing to unpack in terms of like the religious language being evoked there. You get a bunch of you get like tax benefits and stipends and educational benefits. Your like first degree after moving is free. And it's the government. It's not even, nonprofit, like non-governmental organizations or nonprofits. There are nonprofits that like specialize in helping you fill out the paperwork, but it is just heavily encouraged. It's very, like, since the earliest days of the state, been something that they wanted. It's something that they've seen as like a valuable tool. Something that's like also very important to maybe talk about and realize is that it also whenever Jews across the world are under any form of persecution or violence or lack of safety, whether it's because they're Jewish or not, then Israel is there to welcome them in and give them citizenship and give them these benefits, and then utilize their bodies to displace Palestinians. So that's like a complexity that is very, very prominent. The Russia-Ukraine war, when Russia started the war in Ukraine in 2021, a lot of Ukrainian Jews sort of fled to Israel. And a lot of them were even like more directly placed in settlements, basically. And yeah, and then I see another question here that 82% of Israelis supported the genocide, and why is that? I wish it were a one-word answer, and I wish I had like really meaningful insight. It's everything. I mean, it's definitely the education system. It's definitely, to me, it's the draft is the beginning and end of it. It's the draft and the militarism that, because of the Israeli draft, there are a lot of other factors, of course, but basically, it creates this worship of the army. There's this like deep internalized idea in most of Israeli society that the army can do no wrong, and like that really is totally separate from anything else. It's separate from the government, or like separate, like if you like Netanyahu or not or whatever. And what that kind of means is that like if the army is doing something, it must retroactively be good and correct. And there's like a deep dehumanization of Palestinians that is like incredibly prevalent to the average Israeli's outlook on the genocide and on like the other acts of aggression in the region that have expanded from it. Yeah, that sounds great.
Thanks. Did you ever encounter any settlers from New York? And I believe you mentioned you were from New York. Were you ever attacked by any settlers from New York? And able to have any interesting conversations with them, if so? And my second question is, I don't know. When I first came across this, I went to Palestine for the first time in November, and I met somebody in Al Khair. Maybe you know her. Her name is Anurada. She's from New York. And I later met her in a cafe in Jerusalem, and I sort of asked her, like, how do you find the courage to do this work? And she's probably more my age. You're pretty young still. So I appreciated her perspective of saying, like, she's at this time in her life when she's willing to lose her life over this. But you're much younger, and I guess I find it fascinating and really, like, I guess it's hard to, I can't put myself in that position of, like, I almost want to find myself feeling that way, but I don't know how somebody gets to that point where they're willing to do this kind of work, which is very incredibly honorable and an incredible sacrifice.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, for the first question, I've like had run-ins with like soldiers or settlers that I could tell are from the U.S., if not New York, specifically. Never exactly had any conversations about it. I'm not in the habit of trying to change anyone's mind in that context. There are people that are doing like better work to de-radicalize these people in like a broader, more appropriate context. I once knew one of the soldiers. That was like a funny, bizarre interaction, and it ended up being like very random, weird story that I won't get into now. Probably helped me out in that case. It was like somebody I knew from a long time ago. And yeah, I mean, in terms of the second question, I honestly I'm not sure. I think you kind of I'm 31. I don't know, if that's old or young or what. I think I look younger than I am, which is funny in these contexts. Um, and yeah, I kind of I never thought about it. I just kind of like showed up and kept putting one foot in front of the other, and here I am. And now it's habit, and habit is forming. And I will say that kind of like the two things that I do think maybe affect my ability to like keep putting myself in to keep doing this work and keep putting myself in these situations where I do know that I might be attacked. And it also like with the privilege I have that I do 99% chance to know that, certain things are off the table. But more specifically, I do love combat sports. That's like a weird side thing, of like I wrestled in high school and coached for a long time, and now I do a lot of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and that's kind of helped the way that I internalize like that sort of physical violence and stress. And the other thing is just the relationships and the friendships. It's just so much more different when you're like, oh, I see this political thing happening is bad, I'm against it, and I want to do something, and that's like what gets you through the door, and that's amazing. And then there's my friends are being oppressed and and hurt and even killed. Like I have friends that were killed by Israel's violence, and there's no there's no hitting an off switch after that. You don't, it stops mattering. Like especially in Al-Khair, particularly in other communities as well. But like I'm never gonna stop going to Al-Khair. So like whatever happens when I get there is kind of moot.
Thanks. I didn't start following you until you went back in December or November. That's when I sort of came across your work and was pretty glued to your videos. So you are planning to go back at some point when you can, intermittently, with whatever you're doing in Boston?
Yeah. The plan for, the rest of my life basically is keep going back and forth as much as possible. That might be in the summer, it might be in the olive harvest. It kind of will always be a little touch and go. And I want to answer the question that just popped up now in the chat, if that's okay. And then I want to kind of say some final words. Yeah, so to answer the question in the chat just now about sort of ex-Soviet country Jews, they are Jewish overwhelmingly. It's important to not sort of erase that largely. And I know that the person who wrote this, is not trying to disparage anyone or offend anyone, but basically there are different times when Israel differentiates between who they consider Jewish. And the bar, by far the lowest standard of Jewishness for the state, is to get citizenship and join the army, which is basically one Jewish grandparent. And the vast majority of these people, would pretty clearly meet that definition. And then sort of for all the civil, religious, legal stuff that in terms of there's no civil marriage in Israel. So if you want to get married, you have to get married through the rabbinate, through the rabbinic body. And then all of a sudden their bar is much higher than the state's bar for joining the army. So then you have this position where all these former Soviet Jews, who by and large grew up much more secular, are able to prove their Jewishness to the state in terms of basically moving and receiving a certain amount of shelter on their part, and also being utilized into the colonial effort, but then not Jewish enough to get married, or lots of other things where this comes up in daily life, which just kind of goes to show that like oppressive systems oppress. It's what they do, and even if they're sort of advertised as being offering a certain group safety, there are always going to be people that are going to be excluded from that, and they will use you when you can and just use you where they can and where they want, to discard you when they don't and they don't want. And yeah. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind words. Yeah. Thank you all for
Thank you.
coming. Bye.